Welcome to Maps and Meta-Analysis.
Looking at California cities. Hi, I'm Darvesh Borhe.
And I'm Justin Hurst, and this is Facts and Folsom,
a meta-analysis.
Hey guys, welcome back to episode 13 of Facts and Folsom. This week is a non-city council meeting week, so we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into sales tax. We won't actually go into maybe as much depth into Folsom specific sales tax situation, but we wanted to cover just a bit of context around sales tax. You know, what are the different constituent parts? Where does it come from? Comparatively, how does it work across California in sort of broad strokes? And what kind of data that we were looking for, and that, you know, the data that we were able to find, the data that we weren't able to find, and kind of what we expected out of the data and like what our experiences were there. And maybe just like kind of proactive suggestions on what kind of data would be useful to answer the kind of questions that we have that we feel like are probably reflective of the kind of concerns that like everyday people would have if they looked at something like the city budget, like Folsom city budget, or they're even just some other city budget. Like we feel like these are pretty general questions overall.
Especially since we're having these conversations with City Council during the budgeting process, and recurringly about revenue sources down into the future, sales tax being the emphasis. As we pointed out before, there's been a bit of a plateau in terms of the growth rate of sales tax, but even then, it's still the second largest source of individual tax revenue for the city. So we kind of want to position where we are now in reference to where we've been as a city, as well as where we could be going.
Yeah, and so I'll start out, and then Justin will kind of jump in and provide a bit more context. So really, at the outset of this episode, I actually wanted to look at what building permits Folsom had issued historically, and to try to see if there was a correlation in the number or the frequency or the types of building permits that Folsom had issued, and if that has any correlation with the decline in sales tax revenue. So my hypothesis was something like this, where I thought, okay, well, maybe since from 2013 to 2017, which is kind of as far back as the charts go in the city council presentations, maybe that growth was sort of commensurate with the property tax growth, because we were just issuing more building permits and more of this like commercial real estate was opening and businesses were filling it, sort of at a rate commensurate with property taxes. And that maybe what decoupled in 2016 or 2017 was just that we started issuing these things at a slower rate. So it's not that there's like less demand to open a business. It's not that there are like less, like old places available, but maybe just like that the actual growth in each of these departments have sort of decoupled. And so in order to try to validate this hypothesis, I basically tried to look at the City of Folsom's website and tried to see if I could find some historical record of all of the building permits that were issued. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find it. And maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm like not looking in the right place in the city's website. But generally, it seemed geared towards people who were using like an online ticketing system to either like submit or review permits. So these would be like contractors, if they're building something in Folsom, this would be like the online interface through which they can see if their permit is approved or apply for like a new permit, things like that. It also seems like there's a residential portal. So for example, like let's say you replace like your water heater in your house or something like that. There's a specific permit that you need. And so like a building inspector can come in and, basically like sign off on that permit, and then like you can submit it if, for example, like you reinstalled your water heater in your home, like you didn't hire a contractor to do it. So basically things of that nature were very easily accessible on the website, which is probably what like most people really use the website for. But I was hoping to have more historical data. I did find some historical data on Placer County as a whole. So they basically had a big table where they had like the permit ID, they had the sort of type of lot. So, whether it's commercial, it actually got like pretty granular. I can read off some of the names. So for example, there's a column called scope, and this basically lists like, okay, what was this permit actually issued for? And so one of them is like renewal permit, some of it is commercial electrical service. So this would be like, okay, this is a commercial area that got some commercial electrical service. There's a service station, there's single family homes that are above 3,000 square feet, which is like quite specific. There's single family homes below 3,000 square feet. So it's kind of fascinating that those have kind of different permitting structures. There's stuff for plumbing, for generators. There's cell co-location city. So like all these different types of things were broken down, and this is what I was hoping to see in Folsom as well, so that we could hopefully go through it and maybe aggregate it by type of business, like all these kind of things, and try to slice it and dice it and see if there's actually any material difference in that, and either like confirm or reject our hypothesis. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find that. However, I did reach out to, I believe it was Zach Granando. Oh wait, hold on, Scott. What is it? I want to say this right. Scott Zangrando. Sorry, I butchered the name the first time. Scott Zangrando. He's the chief building official in the building services department within the city of Folsom. So I basically just reached out and explained our situation, and maybe there is some historical data. Maybe there's just no like convenient online portal to access it. So hopefully he can get us some access to that, because that would be very useful, and we would hope to have some kind of like figures for you guys. At the very least, I will try to add maybe some figures that I could generate from the Placer County data, and just like maybe add like a little excerpt around this part and like voice it over or something like that, just to give you guys a sense of what kind of questions we would be trying to answer about Folsom, but just to kind of give you like the broad contours of like, okay, this is a kind of plot that we would look at, maybe some statistical tests to see like whether there's a significant change year over year, stuff like that. But yeah, so that's kind of where we are there. Yeah, I know. Anything you want to add to that? Otherwise, we can kind of move on to filling in some more context around sales tax.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add. That's more your area than mine.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. So yeah, do you want to explain a bit about maybe sales taxes in California and some of the things that you discovered in your research process?
Yeah, I would say rather than doing a deep dive into sales tax, I did more of a large shallow pool dive, where I focused on a lot of comparative breadth of data rather than deeply into getting into the question of specifically why is it that we're seeing these decreases in the growth rates of sales tax revenue. So I'm going to go a little bit top down, starting with a picture of average local government revenues at the U.S. level, then down to the state level, and then down to Folsom and some related things with our own sales tax story. So to start with, when you look at local government general revenues, based on this chart that I have from the 2017 fiscal year, your average local government will get about a third of their budget from intergovernmental transfers. And within that, 2/3 of it is related to education, coming from what I presume to be in most states property tax revenues that go to the state and then are distributed to localities based on their individual revenues as well as their school districts. So even though technically is the local property taxes end up funding your local schools, it will pop up as an intergovernmental transfer because of the way that the money is collected and then redistributed. The second largest source of revenue is about 30%, and that is property taxes, more directly to cities rather than going to the state and the schools. And then the third largest category for your average city is about 22% of charges and miscellaneous funds. So think of things like permitting fees. This would be an example of what they would consider to be charges and miscellaneous funds. And then fourth is where we have our sales tax, and that's only about 7% for your average locality. Now, the state might look a bit different because of different tax rates. Even your localities will have different tax rates, and we've talked a lot about that. But in particular, for the city of Folsom, the two biggest items are going to be your property taxes and your sales tax that are more relevant. As far as intergovernmental transfers is concerned, the city of Folsom's budget doesn't list that in a way that is in bulk. Darvesh, you had a good point about this earlier.
Yeah. So it seems like whenever these kind of like intergovernmental transfers, especially when things are coming in from the federal level, it seems like they are kind of tied to the specific grant or program that they're attached to. So, for example, I think there's a program called like ARPA that was, or maybe APRA, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was APRA.
Related to COVID. So basically, this was like the manifestation of the kind of like COVID relief funds as they applied to cities specifically. And so basically, in the budget, there would be a line item that says like, hey, okay, these are the APRA funds that we got in as a city. Here's what we actually divided it into. So that's how we're using like this grant specifically. It also gets a bit more complicated when we talk about like these like large capital investment projects. So things like highway overpasses, big roads, maybe just like freeway exits, things like that. These require often tens of millions or like hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, and a lot of the bulk of this money is often provided in terms of grants from like the Department of Transportation federally. And so it gets kind of complicated because sometimes in order to secure a grant, you have to put some percentage of that money in, as the city, just so you have some kind of stake in that project. But sometimes what cities will do is they will use money from previous grants to earmark money for new grants, to kind of like make sure that there is no gap in funding for these types of like big projects where you might be actually pulling in money from multiple different departments and these sorts of things. Like, for example, even though a lot of the COVID relief it's not strictly from like the Department of Transportation, but it might be used for transit related projects or something in a city. And so, to actually achieve that, you need to draw funding from multiple sources, and it's not really prudent for the city to actually like aggregate these into like one big pool of money, because oftentimes they come with these stipulations of, okay, we'll give you this money if you use it for X or Y or Z. And so I can kind of understand why it's separate, but yeah, I guess for our purposes, it would be useful to look at it as like one big transfer. So yeah, but I will say like a lot of it is typically directed towards specific projects, and it seems like the bulk of it in absolute terms is actually just dedicated towards these like big capital projects, like highway exits and things like that. Things which connect a city to like the rest of the federal infrastructure or something like that. I'm trying to think of like another example. Maybe, I don't know, I can imagine maybe a town near Yosemite or something getting funding from like the national parks or something like that to build build like a parking lot or something like for Yosemite visitors, something of that sort. I mean, that's just like that latter part is just speculation on my part, but those are the only like kind of 2 cents I had to add to that.
Okay, and then before we get into sales tax for the rest of the episode, I'll just make one more quick point on property taxes, since that is such a big portion of the city of Folsom's budget, as well as a lot of the revenue throughout the state. So in terms of the proportion of the property tax that is received, I have a chart from a few years ago for the state of California on how that's broken down by types of local government. So I'll just give you a broad sense of how that looks.
And we'll try to like put it in the episode around this point so that you can like visually follow along.
Yeah, hopefully I'm pointing to it somewhere.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I'll go. Actually, I don't know. Do you want yourself like in a corner?
Sure, you can do whatever.
We can talk about this afterwards. Yeah.
He's the editor, so he has creative control as far as I'm concerned. So in terms of the breakdown, schools through that pathway that I mentioned earlier will end up with about 38% as of a couple of years ago of that property tax revenue. So they are the single biggest individual category, which historically has been this case, that schools are mostly funded by local property taxes. Special districts, which is a topic in and of itself, I won't really define it. It's just kind of like a legal recognition of an area. That's about 8%. Redevelopment agencies get about 12%. Not entirely sure what falls into that category, so pardon me. Cities themselves will get 18% of that property tax revenue. So even though it is the largest single tax revenue source for the city of Folsom, we're only getting a small piece of the pie. And then counties get slightly more at 24% as of when this chart was created. So the county of Sacramento will get more of the property tax than the city of Sacramento will directly from houses in the city of Folsom. Something else that would be useful to note is going into the different taxes that are levied. Property taxes can be subdivided into a bunch of different categories. No, I got it on my phone. Sure. Where you have residential owner occupied. So like when you think of your traditional suburban home, that's a residential owner occupied home, which is the largest individual category of property tax for the state of California. Commercial and industrial property taxes actually are a smaller proportion of the property tax in the state. So especially for a suburb like the city of Folsom, your residential areas are going to be what's driving a lot of that revenue. Shifting over to sales tax for the rest of the episode. As we mentioned before, the city of Folsom has a tax rate of about 7.75% for sales tax. Comparatively, the city of Sacramento's tax rate is about 8.75% sales tax, whereas the statewide tax rate itself is 7.25. Now, the way that the statewide tax rate is structured is the baseline for every city and locality in the state. Of that 7.25%, 1% is dedicated to local cities. So, for example, if you spend $1, 7 cents is the total sales tax rate in the city of Folsom, but one of those dollars will come back. And then your average local sales tax, cities are able to increase the sales tax locally and then directly pocket that increase. In the state of California, that averages to about 1.57% on top of the initial statewide tax rate of 7.25%. So doing the math on that, it would end up being like you're nearly at 9% sales tax rate in your average local city in California, which, some go higher, some go lower. Folsom is definitely on the lower end of that spectrum, where we only really have an effective like 0.5% sales tax increase, whereas like we're at a third of your average other local city. So that could be a factor of where maybe some of the city council is pushing in that direction of saying, hey, we could be increasing our sales tax to meet the region, to meet the state of California, because that's just what everyone else is doing. And especially because that amount is expected to come out at millions of dollars per year, which is enough to make up for the projected budget shortfall, at least in the near term. Sales tax is an interesting one. Because there are progressive and regressive taxes. And basically what that means is a progressive tax is a tax that takes proportionally based on income. So if you think about it, like if you're a poor person paying more in tax than like Elon Musk, for example, you're not paying a progressive tax in that sense. A progressive tax would be like, if there's a wealth tax, it's directly tied to the value of your assets. So therefore, the rich are paying more proportionally and in total than the poor people of a society are. The converse of that is a regressive tax, which you can think of it as a tax that's a flat rate that everyone pays. So it disproportionately impacts the poor because it's a higher percentage of their income. And sales tax is an example of regressive tax because it applies to everyone. If you're buying a car, it doesn't matter what your income is, you're still paying the same tax rate. That being said, it is a relatively small tax compared to a lot of other taxes in the state of California and in the United States in general. So even though it is considered a regressive tax, especially for a community like Folsom, which skews more middle, higher income, it wouldn't necessarily create a lot of inequity, like a 0.5% tax increase. That question of why the tax rate plateaued in terms of its growth rate in 2017 or thereabouts was something that I tried to look into a little bit. I found one indication, which I'll mention in a moment, that could be a partial explainer, but I feel like it's an incomplete story. I believe you share this understanding that we would expect maybe the growth rate to not look the way that it does because it's still pretty consistent if it was just this offset. So the offset that I found was that in 2012, Proposition 30 was passed by the state of California, which was called the Schools and Local Public Safety Protection Act of 2012. And what that proposition did was it imposed a 0.25% temporary statewide sales and use tax increase throughout the state. And that rate expired at the end of 2016. So beginning January 1st, 2017, the effective state tax rate dropped by 0.25% for everywhere. And some localities have increased their tax rate perhaps at the same time to make up for this revenue drop, or ahead of time in anticipation of it. But the city of Folsom did not. So I feel like this could be a partial variable in explaining why there's been a drop in sales tax revenue around that time. But it still feels like an incomplete picture, and unfortunately I wasn't able to find any more data on what could be completing that puzzle. Finally, one thing I'll mention is that a proposition in the city of Folsom itself was also proposed a few years ago in 2018, directly doing what the city council has been discussing now, of increasing sales tax revenues by 0.5%. And it was a pretty, I think, fairly worded sales tax measure. It was very fair. It talked about the services that would be funded. It even gave the number of funds that it would give every year, about $8.4 million to the annual city budget. And it was for a 10-year period. So if it was passed in 2018, it probably would have been starting 2019 through 29. That being said, when it was voted on here in Sacramento, it was defeated by a pretty high majority of people. 78.5% voted against this measure. So even with everything that the city is doing now to try and find additional revenue, if the mayor's suggestion for an economic development person comes through and they come to the same conclusion that the city really needs to just increase its sales tax revenue, that's no guarantee that even though the city went that route, that the voters will approve it. Because historically, at least locally, it seems that voters do not have much of an appetite for increasing sales tax.
Yeah, and also visually based on the revenues by type graph that was shown in previous like budget meetings in the city council, it actually seems like in 2018 itself, the decoupling was not as obvious. So I think even any sort of like empirical case that you might make to a voter might not be a very convincing one, because you might look at it and say like, hey, if we continue on this trend, then we will decouple. But there's sort of enough variation in previous data points to suggest that, well, okay, maybe this is decoupling, but maybe this is just kind of like the natural fluctuation of like year to year sales taxes. And there's nothing here that would suggest, an actual decline in sales tax over time. So I would hope that perhaps with, some figures like this, or, kind of extra information about the deficit that the city of Folsom is going to run into, that people would make a slightly different decision. I mean, then again, I mean, like you said, 70.5%, that's like it's a pretty strong majority of people. And I feel like you would have to make a very convincing case. I suspect also that maybe that like 8.4 million figure, or like, somewhere thereabouts, maybe people don't see it as strictly additive to the quality of the city and the budget. Maybe they see it as like, oh, that's $8 million being taken out of 80,000 people or 60,000 people's kind of hard-earned paychecks. So maybe just the kind of like mental framing of it might be such that you see a number and you say like, okay, I'm contributing to that portion. That means something is being taken away from me, and I don't actually see the material benefits to the city in the kind of immediate term. So yeah,
I think one other thing to mention on that is because of inflation rates and the preceding years, it's fair to suspect that number is probably higher now. I would expect it to maybe be 9 million-ish. But I think now that the city is in a fundamentally different situation, where back then, we had a healthy budget, we probably were exceeding revenue in terms of what we were spending. But now we're definitively going into several years of growing deficit. So now that the city's a little bit more on the cash poor side, there could be a more compelling case to make to voters to say, hey, like, instead of expanding services, now you're voting on us to just keep your existing services.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I mean, I could also see a counter argument there, which is like, oh, why don't we kind of run you could always make this kind of like austerity, like reduce waste argument, I think, as a pundit. I mean, from what we've seen, like those would be some pretty hard cuts. Almost 50% of the budget is police and firefighters, and it doesn't seem like most people in Folsom are. It seems like most people in Folsom are quite reticent to make any sort of cuts to that, because it seems like a lot of what comes up in city council meetings is like public safety, the need for more police officers and firefighters, like issues with people who are unhoused, or at least like the perception of what like the unhoused community poses to the residents of Folsom. So I doubt any sort of cut there would actually be like well received. So I don't know. It's like what is that phrase? It's like a kind of immovable object and unstoppable force kind of thing. I mean, I don't want to paint it quite dire like that, but it seems like these two competing interests, which are kind of at odds, which is like, one is just austerity for avoiding these kind of taxes, but the other is also like a kind of liberal funding of these programs, which we just as a society or as a community find very beneficial, and we feel like it is a pretty strong point of attraction to attract people to Folsom itself. Like, to live here, to start their lives here, build families, like build businesses, etc. And so I think that's a pretty fair argument that someone could make, is that like, hey, this seems intangible now, but it has all these like kind of externalities that are ultimately benefiting the city. So I don't know. Yeah, all in all, it's a tough call. I mean, I really don't envy anyone who has to like put this forth. You know, it's not just like line items in a budget. These are like actual people's lives and people's hard-earned money too. Like they could choose to live anywhere. They could choose to spend their money elsewhere. It could also kind of backfire, and even just the perception of a higher sales tax, even if it wouldn't affect people monetarily, you know, could basically convince people that like, oh, hey, maybe I shouldn't spend my money as much. Maybe I shouldn't like eat out in Folsom as much or shop or, you know, all these sorts of things. So it could honestly have deleterious effects, even if it's sort of financially feasible for the residents of Folsom. So definitely a lot of factors to consider.
Yeah.
I don't know, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think that was my shallow overview of all the different sales tax things that we were looking into for this episode. Hopefully, if we come across more data, we can supplement what we talked about today, especially with the conversation ongoing in City Council. And as things are brought up in City Council meetings in the future, we'll definitely revisit a lot of this conversation.
Yeah, and definitely if I don't know, anyone has access to even like other cities or municipalities that actually have like you know, well-functioning sort of like web portals to view this kind of like historical data, we would love to, you know, bring this up at like a city council meeting or something, just to propose like, oh, hey, here's like a kind of like a shining example of what this kind of data could look like, and here's some of the figures that we could make, and here's how it would inform the public. So it would behoove the planning department to, you know, make a website like this, or, you know, put it as like a priority so that we can understand better, you know, where these revenues are coming from, and hopefully like address this budget shortfall. Because ultimately that's why we're doing it. It's not just some like kind of like, you know, was it like a ivory tower exercise of just being like, oh wow, this is a cool academic thing that we could like we actually want to figure out the root cause of this.
Yeah.
And the way you do that is by testing different hypotheses. You know, like if you ask 100 people like what they think the issue is, they're all going to tell you different things. And so ultimately the only veracity you can have with any argument is like with some sort of data and some sort of hopefully narrative like built around that data, but ultimately has to be grounded in something that is actually like measurable and true.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, with that we'll end the episode. We'll see you guys next time.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.